I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. Hello, everybody. Here we are, a month into 2020 already. Now, I'm hoping that the new year is treating you somewhat kindly, although I must say that it has started out pretty rough and ready. Stay safe and somewhat sane out there, folks. Now, 2020 is also being called the start of a new decade for all of us. However, that's not a statement that I necessarily agree with. Is 2020 the first year of a new decade, or is it really the last year of the decade we've been living through? Doesn't the new decade really start on January 1st, 2021? Yes, these are the kind of things that keep me up all night. Welcome to my brain. According to the U.S. Naval Observatory, who keeps the world's master clock ticking, the new millennium didn't begin until January 1st, 2001, not January 1st, 2000. I know, those 3 zeros look really good. The master clock, by the way, is basically the timekeeper that every computer and every phone and every internet web page in the world synchronizes with. And it's not only the Naval Observatory that says this is the last year of the decade that we're living right now. Astronomers, people who deal with the passage of time in light years, also define the start of the decade with the 01 year. And yet, even though the world's official timekeeper says otherwise, most people believe 2020 is the start of the new decade, and I will bet that many of you out there agree with that too. And yet, there is just enough of us irritating nerd weirdos to make this a debate that comes up every 10 years. Now, I bring this up because it speaks to the amount of importance that we give our own perception to the world around us. And that perception does not necessarily always adhere to fact. If we can't agree on what year a decade starts in, then it is a safe bet that we won't agree 100% about anything that happened in that decade. It's a time-honored tradition to look back upon a block of years and try to determine significant trends and discoveries and moments. We do that because we want to give that passage of time some meaning. Hey, it's a fun exercise, but I don't think that those of us who just lived through this decade have the emotional distance to look at it realistically. Like a recently divorced couple, we are just too close to it to be objective. We were so heavily invested in everything that was going on around us that we may not be able to see the forest for the trees. I don't think anybody in any generation really knows what was truly important about that decade that they lived in until the passage of time gives it context, maybe an entire other decade. There is truth in the old saying, time will tell. Be that as it may, I love to start conversations, even if sometimes those conversations feel a lot like bar fights. And for this conversation, I want to talk about the state of horror over the last 10 years. A time period that I consider a pretty damn good decade for horror. And I'm sure that there are those who will hotly disagree with me. And quite honestly, there is a lot that happened in this decade that wasn't very good. There were trends and innovations that debuted in this decade that started great, but ended the decade poorly. Due to technology and a 24/7 mentality, this decade moved through events and stories and trends faster than any 10 years previously. There is so much to talk about and so many avenues to follow that I felt I needed to turn this show into 2 separate episodes with 2 separate tones. So much of this decade splits into the yin and the yang, the dark and the light, the house divided, that I wanted to express that in 2 separate episodes. This episode, Death by Convenience, Part 1, will be a look at the light, the good, and cool things that happened in horror over this decade. Death by Convenience, Part 2, will be a look at the dark side of the Janus mask of horror over the last 10 years. That'll be those trends that left us with movie fatigue and good ideas that went sour and some ideas that were never good at any time in history. Part 1 of Death by Convenience. I want to talk about some of the trends that I saw that I felt pushed horror in new and better directions. I'm interested to see where the cultural and technological changes that this decade gave us pushes the horror genre in the future. As tastes change and variety increases, we are going to see some interesting adaptations and some interesting mutations as well. I want to talk about some of the highlights and some of the films that might have been missed in all the hubbub around Get Out and Stephen King's It. And I also want to examine how culture informed the horror films and how the horror films themselves informed what was happening in the culture. I think some important things happened in the world of horror this decade, but you know what? Only time will tell. And just to start up a good old-fashioned bar fight, I will end this 2-part episode by announcing the movie that I feel defined this decade. Oh, defined the decade, right? Hell, if we can't even agree on what year starts a damn decade, I'm pretty sure that my pick is going to be controversial no matter what it is. So, I've been actively watching horror films for the last 4 decades, and I think that this last decade was quite unique. Now, I'm not saying best, I'm not saying greatest, I'm saying unique. I think the amount of variety we had in horror films was uncommon and a product of a specific moment in time. Normally, there is one predominant style or subgenre of horror movies in any given decade. For example, it's generally agreed that the 1980s is the decade of the slasher film. Even though there were supernatural horror films made during that time, the slasher film was by far the most popular subgenre. Jaws gave us the killer animal films in the 1970s, and they were quite popular, but really it was The Exorcist that dominated the decade by making Satan the most popular monster in history. It seemed like every movie in the 70s had something to do with demons, or Satanism, or possession. Even movies that had nothing to do with the devil had titles that evoked him, like the movie Demon Seed. However, it's not so cut and dry to find one dominant trend for the years 2010 to 2019. There were several trend-setting subgenres functioning at the same time. There were zombies, there were serial killers, there were haunted houses, there were creatures, and there were demonic possessions. There were found footage films, and there were slasher films, and there were remakes, and there were folk horror films and horror comedies. There were highly popular foreign films from Brazil and from Korea and from Hong Kong and from Spain. There were horror movies that were told from the point of view of women and people of color and other minorities. That is an awful lot of tributaries leading into the single river of horror. What was amazing about this last decade is that there was room for all of these different types of horror films to thrive. They all had the opportunity to find an audience. I think the reason for this is because of the birth of the most significant technological entertainment development of the decade. This was the decade of streaming services. In the crowded movie theater and cable television market, the addition of Netflix and Amazon Prime added huge amounts of new real estate. Overnight, low-budget independent and foreign horror films had the same distribution opportunities as mainstream films had. These films were now given the time and space to find the right audience. Netflix and Amazon Prime had created a smart business model, so a lot of studios and networks got into the act very quickly. Streaming services became so popular and so profitable that Amazon and Netflix created their own movie studios and created their own content. In fact, Amazon and Netflix had such a good business model that they were able to lure top talent to make high-profile films. By the end of the decade, Netflix had lured legendary director Martin Scorsese to make The Irishman through the studio. Just a few years before that, the debate was hot and heavy over whether a film made on streaming services should even be nominated for Oscars. But guess what? Now, Going into the 2020 Academy Awards, Netflix leads all of the other studios with 24 Oscar nominations. It makes the head spin. Like the invention of the smartphone, the immediate impact of streaming services was game-changing. And also like the invention of the smartphone, I don't think we'll know the true social impact of streaming services for another decade. I think, in the long run, the impact will be deep and vast, and it will be a mixed bag. For better or for worse, Netflix and Amazon changed how we watch films and television series. And it all started with a phenomenon of binge-watching. Ah, yes, binge-watching. The practice of watching multiple episodes or seasons of a television program in rapid succession. Now, those of us hardcore horror junkies who spent decades buying VHS and DVD and Blu-ray box sets of film and TV shows know this concept very well. However, that was more of a geek art form than a popular art form. The invasion of binge-watching into the mainstream was a long and steady process. I think binge-watching was introduced to a large pop culture audience by the Twilight Zone New Year's Day marathon on the Sci-Fi Network. That phenomenon started back in the 1990s, and it got people accustomed to losing a weekend dedicated to the entire catalog of one damn show. It was such a hit that the marathon became a perennial event. The Twilight Zone was the gateway drug. So binge-watching existed before the advent of streaming services, but it took streaming services to popularize binge-watching with the mainstream viewers and make it a legitimate pastime. Suddenly, people who would never sit to watch a movie longer than 2 hours were now watching 10 straight hours of Stranger Things, or the show You, or Castle Rock. In other words, obsessive-compulsive geek fan behavior became proper and normal. And that means that since the viewing habits of the public changed, the most popular storytelling format had changed as well. The traditional screenplay format was usurped by the serialized teleplay. Horror thrived in both the original series format and the ambitious limited series format. Now, the limited series format really came into its own as binge-watching caught on. Having a storyline complete its arc in 8 to 10 episodes was a perfect compromise between episodic television and a feature film. You could have a limited series like The Haunting of Hill House go into much more literary depth than a feature film would ever allow. And streaming meant that you could binge and you didn't have to wait a week to see the next episode. And speaking of The Haunting of Hill House, the Netflix and Amazon Prime studios also took chances on indie writers and directors. Mike Flanagan is a very good example. Flanagan was a respected indie horror filmmaker who made excellent but underseen movies like Absentia, Oculus, and Hush. But his movie version of Stephen King's Gerald's Game and his adaptation of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House played in millions of households. Both of those were made through Netflix studios and they premiered on Netflix. So Flanagan now had 2 critical and audience hits that he parlayed into the big-budget theatrical release of Stephen King's Dr. Sleep. The birth of streaming services was a big reason that there was so much variety in horror over this decade, but it wasn't the only reason. There was an awful lot of diversity in the movie theaters as well, thanks to a few maverick horror studios. Independent film studios like Blumhouse and A24 made excellent, cutting-edge films with first-time directors. And best of all, those studios took horror films seriously. A24 alone was responsible for The Witch, Ex Machina, Under the Skin, Green Room, The Killing of a Sacred Deer, A Ghost Story, It Comes at Night, Hereditary, The Lighthouse, Midsummer, and even the wildly quirky Kevin Smith film Tusk and Swiss Army Man. And then there's Blumhouse, which was the home of the Paranormal Activity franchise, the Insidious franchise, and the Purge franchise. Not only that, Blumhouse also released director Scott Derrickson's super creepy Sinister and its sequel, and Rob Zombie's underrated Lords of Salem. They also released Mike Flanagan's Ouija, Origin of Evil, and Hush. And M. Night Shyamalan's The Visit and Split. And Blumhouse also released Happy Death Day and its sequel Happy Death Day 2, and somehow along the way found some time to release a little film named Get Out. Just between those two studios, you have an amazing output of interesting and wildly different horror films over the last 10 years. And yet, the output of those two studios are only a portion of the story of the last decade. Actor Elijah Wood and director Daniel Noah formed SpectraVision, a production company that specializes in eclectic and offbeat horror films. They released Toad Road, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, Cooties, The Boy, The Greasy Strangler, and Mandy. And they also helped bring mad genius director Richard Stanley back from obscurity with 2019's Color Out of Space. And just like the old Ginsu knife commercials, I find myself saying, and that's not all, folks. The great indie film studio Glass Eye Pix, who have been flying the horror banner proudly for 35 years, kept pace in this last decade. They gave us Stakeland, The Innkeepers, The Ranger, Bitter Feast, Tales from Beyond the Pale, Darling, and Late Phases. And last year, Larry Fessenden gave his somber and haunting updating of the Frankenstein story in the movie Depraved. From micro studios to the big-budget Hollywood studios and to the foreign market, variety and diversity were everywhere. You know, you need look no further for an example than the year 2010 to see how many different types of horror films were available to us simultaneously in just 1 year. I'm going to talk about a few of the ones that I felt were standouts or ones that made an impact. Some of them may have even started some trends. There was the excellent nature horror film The Reef from Australia in 2010. A group of friends are hunted by a great white shark after their sailboat capsizes on the Great Barrier Reef. This is such a good, creepy horror film, full of suspense and dread. The key to the success of this film is an elegantly simple story, elegantly shot, elegantly told. There are only a handful of characters sitting on the hull of a capsized sailboat with a great white shark circling them. So much of this film is full of dread that builds up to a few moments of perfectly timed horror and fast as lightning violence. The director is smart enough to only show us the shark when he absolutely needs to. There is one sequence where a character is in the water, and he floats away from the group. And in a split-second cut, he is attacked and blood gouts everywhere. The only thing we see before he is struck is a thin spray of water moving super fast that is caused by the dorsal fin barely breaking the surface. It is so fast and so subtle, it's almost subliminal. Until the gouts of blood, that is. Open Water essentially resurrected the nature horror film back in 2003, but 2010 was the year that nature ran amok in full force. Andre Aja's absurd but super violent Piranha 3D was popular, but I think the serious and elegantly constructed The Reef turned the tide. Pardon the joke. And I think this is a film that normally would have been overlooked a decade earlier, but streaming services gave it an audience. The services brought this small Australian film to a wide audience, and suddenly, we started seeing dread-filled shark movies in the theaters. We got The Shallows and 47 Meters Down and its sequel. It's one of several examples where streaming services directly affected what was happening in the movie theaters. But it wasn't just sharks getting payback from Mother Nature in this decade. In 2014, we got the excellent Backcountry, which has a grizzly bear stalking a couple lost in the deep woods of Canada during the off-season. No rangers around. And in 2015, we got Into the Grizzly Maze, which was not very good. We also had horror movies where man's best friend went rogue, like The Exceptional White God, a horror story told through a dog's point of view. We also got Green Room, where a trio of pit bulls are physical extensions of the evil of their masters. By the way, just one more comment about the movie The Reef before I move on to the rest of the decade. It was directed by Andrew Traucki, who has kind of become a nature horror specialist. Prior to The Reef, he made another fantastic nature horror film, Black Water is a story about a group of friends hunted by a giant crocodile in the endless Australian mangrove swamps. Really, really atmospheric, really chilling, really suspenseful. If you do find yourself a big fan of nature runs amok films, I recommend a double feature of Black Water and The Reef. 2010 was the start of a decade that gave us an embarrassment of riches in all variety of horror stories. And here are some more examples of what was available to us. There was the wonderful vampire apocalypse road movie, coming-of-age film, Jim Mickles' Stakeland. Stakeland is a great example of low-budget filmmaking that refuses to lower the ambitions of the script just because of money. It is highly recommended. It also came out with a pretty darn good sequel. Now, if you're looking for absurdist comedy with your horror, I highly recommend Tucker and Dave vs. Evil and the French film Rubber, both from 2010. 2010, by the way, was also a very good year for experimental foreign films. There was The Silent House from Uruguay, which tells the story of a home invasion at dusk, in real time, with no cuts. Hey, it might be a stunt, but it's a good stunt, and it pays off in one sequence towards the end where you forget that you're watching a movie. Because it feels so immediate and so live, I kind of forgot that I was watching a movie. I kind of felt like I was in a JC's haunted house. I knew everything wasn't real, but at the same time, I was worried about getting scared. And then there was We Are What We Are, a Mexican film about a family of modern-day cannibals that is as empathic as it is disturbing. Highly recommended. Hong Kong also gave us many excellent horror films in the past decade, and the movie Dream Home started the decade off with a bloody bang. Try watching the first 5 minutes of Dream Home and see if you are not catching yourself holding your breath. 2010 also gave me a new favorite Christmas movie, and that is Sint, or the English translation is Saint, from the Netherlands. Sint portrays Saint Nick as the angel of death, and he is ruthless to all the girls and boys. It doesn't matter how good they've been. It would be dishonest of me as well to not mention a Serbian film, because it is so notorious and so infamous. It may be the most polarizing horror film since Cannibal Holocaust. A Serbian film is about a former porn star who is lured back into the business and endangers his family when his gig becomes a snuff film. It is a well-acted, well-directed, and beautifully shot horror film. But its graphic nature and nihilistic vision splits the horror community right down the middle. Its ability to split the horror community so divisively and still be so infamous makes it a notable film of the last decade. 2010 also saw the release of Darren Aronofsky's Black Swan, which I think influenced horror films way more than it is given credit for. I think that the critical and box office success of Black Swan paved the way for artful, slow-burn horror films that showcase dread over jumps. Without Darren Aronofsky, I'm not sure we would have gotten the films of Nicholas Winding Refn, Ari Aster, or Robert Eggers. Black Swan is influential in how it pushed the envelope of hybrid vigor, which is the mixing of horror with other genres. It combines a psychological thriller with a showbiz melodrama like All About Eve with the artistry of ballet to tell a surreal horror story. Hybrid vigor challenged the preconceived notions of what a horror movie could look like, and it broadened what the subject matter could be. The experiment of Black Swan paid off and showed other artists that horror was flexible and durable enough to tell any kind of story. It was a challenge that caused debate amongst horror fans, some who rejected movies like Black Swan, The Witch, and Hereditary, and several others, and they still disagree that they're horror movies to this day. Personally, I think horror is made all the better when we don't agree on everything. You know why? Because lockstep is boring. The slow burn tension of Darren Aronofsky's Black Swan may have been the starting point for a group of films that showcased dread, but there was another director whose films and style, I think, were the most influential of the decade. And that would be writer-director James Wan. Considering the movies that James Wan has made over the last decade, it's amazing how rarely he gets mentioned in conversations. He's the creative brainchild behind 3 successful horror franchises: Saw, Insidious, and The Conjuring. The original Saw, with James Wan directing, was back in 2003, but there are still spin-off films from that franchise as recently as 2017. Actually, much to my chagrin, most of them aren't that good. However, both Insidious and The Conjuring and their multiple spin-offs like The Nun and the Annabelle movies are all in this decade. And both Insidious and The Conjuring were unexpected blockbuster hits that pleased longtime horror fans and brought new ones to the fold. You can argue that those two films and their franchises helped make haunted houses and demonic possession movies in demand again. You will hear plenty of discussion about Saw and Insidious and The Conjuring in horror circles. But when it comes to discussing James Wan, especially in conversations about influential horror directors, it is very rare to hear his name. He's a member of a dubious Hall of Fame for making movies that everyone loves, but nobody knows who made them. He's like the Hal Ashby or the Barry Sonnenfeld of the horror genre. And that's a shame, because I think that not only are Insidious and The Conjuring blockbuster franchises, they are also excellent horror films. They deserve the success that was built upon them. The first films, the ones directed by Wan himself, are wonderfully original and unexpectedly intense films. I fell in love with the style back in the original Saw. I remember it well. It was a sequence that involved a character walking through a dark room, armed only with an old-fashioned flash on an SLR camera. The flash would go off and illuminate the room for a split second, and then there would be the high-pitched whine of the flash recharging. That whining sound was recharging the tension and the suspense as the character kept walking forward in the dark, opening closed doors. It was a simple idea executed very well and showed a real understanding of what makes a horror sequence work. And each of his films have memorable sequences like that in them. I was particularly taken by Insidious, which came out of nowhere in 2010. By then, the Saw franchise had run its course, and James Wan hadn't directed anything since his 2007 vigilante film, Death Sentence. At that point, there were not a lot of expectations for a new film by James Wan. Well, that all changed by the end credits of Insidious. Wan took a standard haunted house story and expanded it into a possession film and a supernatural exploration of family trauma. What surprised me about Insidious was how confident and smart the storytelling was. There was a real sophistication as to how James Wan used the entire horror playbook to break patterns and keep the audience off balance. The thing that most impressed me, though, was the director's deft use of liminal space to create shocks. Now, liminal space is that area where you catch something in mid-action, something out of the corner of your eye that you barely register consciously, but it scares you unconsciously. When it's done right, the effect can be both exhilarating and terrifying. And there are at least 3 great liminal space scares in Insidious that are so bizarre and so idiosyncratic that you just don't see them coming. There are some great visual images and concepts in Insidious, and you can see its influence on movies like Sinister. And the underworld that is in Insidious may have influenced the alternate reality of the Upside Down in the hit show Stranger Things. The Conjuring was also a solid and scary horror film that successfully immortalized a creepy porcelain doll and an even creepier Ed and Lorraine Warren. It also created its own creepypasta with something as simple as a game of hide and seek and a set of hand claps. If you watch the original Saw, Insidious, and The Conjuring, you can see a real talent and confident maturity in the work of James Wan. I think that time is going to be very kind to his work, and I'm going to say that this last decade belonged to James Wan. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. The decade also saw the return of a controversial horror subgenre, the notorious rape revenge film. 2009 saw a remake of Wes Craven's Last House on the Left, which garnered some good reviews, which wasn't too surprising because Last House on the Left was notorious, but it was also considered a cultural milestone by critics. It was ugly and it was unpleasant, but it had something to say. The surprise, on the other hand, came in 2010 with a remake of I Spit on Your Grave, the movie Roger Ebert called the most vile and repulsive film ever made. This is a movie that has a brutal 30-minute gang rape, and then the rest of the film is devoted to the woman mutilating and torturing her attackers. When it was released in 1978, the movie only played the grindhouse circuit, and it was reviled by feminists and civic leaders alike. However, times have changed, and certain rape revenge films that used to be reviled are now championed by some feminists. The most surprising one being the reassessment of the original I Spit on Your Grave. Carol Clover, the author of the book Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film, supports it as a feminist film. She states that although the movie gives sadistic pleasure to the viewer, the movie almost always sympathizes with the victim, not the tormentor. And in the end, the victim metes out justice on her attackers on her own terms. Now, we cut to 2010, and the new I Spit on Your Grave amps up the gore and the revenge and becomes a cult hit that doesn't get protested. In fact, it spawns 3 sequels. However, the remake of I Spit on Your Grave and its subsequent sequels were far from the only entries in the rape revenge category. Suddenly, after decades of there being very little, we had a crowded house. In 2011, we get Jack Ketchum's The Woman, where a hunter traps a feral woman from the woods and brings her home to be a toy for his family. Yeah, there are all kinds of wrong in this story, folks, but suffice to say that the woman in the title gets her revenge on the whole family. In the same vein is Bound to Vengeance, where a young girl is chained in a sexual predator's basement and then gets to turn the tables on him. The Soska Sisters' American Mary is, at its heart, a rape revenge film. There was also Return to Sender, where a nurse in a small town gets date raped and then she puts her training to good use. Then there's Paul Verhoeven's Elle, where a woman tracks down an unknown man who raped her and walks directly into a trap. Then there's Girls Against Boys and the film MFA. These 2 films have women teaming up to knock off their collective rapists. 2017 gave us the wild and crazy Revenge, where 3 married men on a trip to the Australian outback try to cover up the murder of their mistress. Even though she falls off a cliff and is impaled on a tree, she doesn't die. Hell hath no fury, and she brings a reckoning to these fellows in a hyper-violent splatterfest that is told through the female gaze. There were all kinds of variations of this theme, including Eli Roth's Knock Knock, where home invasion meets rape revenge film. Except that the women who invade the house are not avenging their own damage, but they are acting to avenge all women who have been abused. They are thinking and acting collectively for a cause, not acting personally. Then there's The Nightingale. The Nightingale is a period piece where an Irish woman hunts British soldiers who raped her and murdered her husband and infant child right in front of her eyes. It is a deeply disturbing film that is equally frustrating, sorrowful, violent, enraging, and powerfully blunt. It is an angry shout-out at a world that still struggles to recognize rape as a violent act instead of a sexual act, and the prison that it makes of victimization. The Nightingale is intentionally not an enjoyable film to watch, but the response to this film has been flat-out disgraceful. When the film showed at the Venice Film Festival, an Italian film critic called director Jennifer Kent a whore and shouted, "Shame on you." As weird as it may sound, the only loud voices of protest to rape revenge films in the last decade are male. So why the change of heart around rape revenge films? Why have they become so popular with women? And why does this level of violence suddenly appeal to the feminists? Well, since I'm a guy, I'm not a qualified expert on the subject, so I needed to defer to someone who was an expert, who had expert knowledge. So I asked that question to Dr. Rhonda Bauman, an author and the editor of Grindhouse Purgatory magazine, so she is not a wilting daisy. She said, "I think a lot of women are just fed up with the hypocrisy of the patriarchal and judicial systems and their archaic notions. While most women aren't going to go out and murder a bunch of assholes, that doesn't mean they haven't embraced it as a valid form of entertainment." I'll end the conversation about rape revenge films where we started, with the original I Spit on Your Grave. Not only did this film get a remake and 3 subsequent sequels, it also spawned a documentary about its making. In the documentary, Growing Up with I Spit on Your Grave, director Meir Zarchi discusses what inspired him to make this movie. One day, while driving through Jamaica Hills with his friend and his daughter, they saw a bloody and naked woman stagger out of a park. Meir pulled the car over and he helped the woman inside. She was able to tell him that she had been beaten and raped, and Meir drove her to the police station. It was the reaction of the police sergeant as he took her account that made Meir want to make the film. The sergeant hardly even pays attention to her. He tells the woman she needs to speak louder, and he asks her again and again what she was doing in the park all alone anyway. The desk sergeant made it seem like it was her fault that she was raped. So, now, we find out that this vile and repulsive film was made from a sense of moral outrage from a real-life event. And nearly 40 years later, that moral outrage seems to be, once again, potent and vital. Now, the irony of talking about feminist support for the rape revenge films of the last decade is that most of them were directed by men. The exceptions to that were American Mary, directed by the Soska sisters, MFA, directed by Natalia Lee, Revenge, directed by Coralie Farajat, and The Nightingale by Jennifer Kent. Now, 4 women directors might seem like a low number considering how many of those movies there were, but here's a fact that might surprise you. That number is 1 more than the entire number of rape revenge films directed by women in all the decades leading up to this last one. Those 3 films are Baise Moi, directed by Coralie Trin, Descent, directed by Talia Lugosi, and Patty Jenkins' Monster. That's it. The good news is that the 4 films that were directed by women are some of the best ones because they tell the narrative from a different perspective. A lot has been written about the male gaze of slasher films, which is where they are looking at women as objects of desire. These new films incorporate the female gaze that shows the same storyline, but to the point of view of the woman. And I think that's what makes the rapes in Jennifer Kent's The Nightingale so disturbing. Kent keeps the camera on the faces and even does cutaways to the point of view of the person being assaulted. And that is why it is so important that there is more diversity in who is telling the stories. See, we've seen that story and that setup 100 times, but we've never seen it from the point of view that Jennifer Kent gives us. And that gives us a completely different intensity to the emotions that we are feeling. Important emotions to feel, important different discussions, even if sometimes you get called a whore over it. And the last 10 years saw a healthy improvement in the number of horror movies that were being told through diverse perspectives. Along with American Mary was Karen Kusama's The Invitation, Jennifer Kent's The Babadook, Lee Janiak's Honeymoon, Jennifer Lynch's Chained, Alice Lowe's Prevenge, Annie Lily Armapour's A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, and Julia DeCurnow's Raw. You know, it's only been 3 years since Get Out blew up in movie theaters and expanded the reach of the horror genre and the power of the metaphor. In that time, there's been an increase in films that have mainstream appeal and still tell the story from an African American perspective. However, there weren't a lot of high-profile horror films directed by African Americans. There was Tales from the Hood 2 by Rusty Cundieff and Jordan Peele's Us, his follow-up to Get Out. Us doesn't get talked about as much as Get Out did because it's not as streamlined and it throws some seriously bizarre curves at you. However, it is a disturbing and funny movie about how we try to bury the ugly side of our history and how we fear our past bubbling up to that surface. In Us, we are the others that we need to watch out for. And I hope to see more African American directors join Jordan Peele in creating great horror movies in the future. And then there's other groups that started getting into the movies more. The LGBTQ perspective started to appear more readily in horror films with movies like Knife Plus Heart, a giallo film set in the gay porn industry. And there was also Cult of Chucky, and The Taking of Deborah Logan, and The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. There has even been a group of horror films made by indigenous filmmakers that comment on real-world terrors instead of just the crazy shaman out in the desert. There's Jeff Barnaby's Rhymes for Young Ghouls, which tells the story of children in peril from a sadistic schoolteacher on the reservation. And then there's Violet, directed by Mark D. Williams, where a Choctaw mental patient escapes and finds her way to her former doctor's home. When she mysteriously dies in the house, things start to get weird very quickly. And then there is director Roderick Pokawacic's horror comedy The Dead Can't Dance. In that film, there is a zombie apocalypse, but 3 Comanche men discover that they are immune to the disease that's turning everyone else into zombies. I'm hoping that this trend that encourages new, fresh voices and diverse voices continues, and it expands to things like regional horror films, where filmmakers can document their local folklore. How cool would it be to have a Blue Mountains horror and an Appalachians Mountains horror and something that goes on in the deserts of Arizona or New Mexico? How cool would it be for America to have its own vital folk horror just like England has, where the stories would have the texture of folk music? Now that's a trend I'd like to see. Of course, not every trend that there is in a decade is a good trend, and some years felt like an elephant burial ground where old ideas come to die. To me, 2011 was one such year. Final Destination 5, and Scream 4, and Hostel 3, and Paranormal Activity 3, and Quarantine 2 staggered off to die. And there were ideas that were just terrible from the word go for horror films, like Shark Night 3D, and I Was a Teenage Werebear, Juan of the Dead, and Zombie Ass. Ah, Zombie Ass. There was an unnecessary remake of Fright Night and a confusing remake of the TV movie Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. Neither of those remakes are particularly bad, they just weren't particularly good. They weren't particularly exciting. And then there was the unnecessary and confusing and unintentionally hilarious prequel to The Thing. The movie had 2 or 3 really good effects in it, including the metamorphosis that led to the split head corpse in John Carpenter's 1982 version. However, so many scenes in this prequel are lesser equivalents to better scenes from the Carpenter film. The worst moment is when the filmmakers try to come up with an original idea that would be the equivalent of a tense blood test scene. Let's just say that grim-faced people screaming, "Show me your teeth!" did not have the chilling effect on me the filmmakers had hoped for. If you see the movie, you'll know what I'm talking about. However, let's talk a little bit more about the good stuff, the things that were unique about the last 10 years that helped horror thrive. One of those was the amazing number of television series that were dedicated to horror. When I was growing up, and quite honestly, even for most of my adult life, there would be 1, maybe 2 television shows that catered to horror. But horror exploded across television this past decade. Since 2011, American Horror Story has been blowing people's minds with horror mixed with kink and comedy and serious gore. American Horror Story is entering its 10th season. In 2010, the world was introduced to The Walking Dead, which became a cultural phenomenon that both invigorated and then killed the zombie genre. Since 2011, the BBC has given us a modern-day version of The Twilight Zone with Black Mirror. In 2016, Netflix gave us another blockbuster series in Stranger Things, a hyper-nostalgic look at the work of Stephen King and the 1980s. It's kind of like Stephen King filtered through David Lynch, and somehow that makes it better than it has the right to be. 3 seasons in, and Stranger Things is still a binge-worthy blockbuster. And then there were shows like Hannibal, and Penny Dreadful, and Outcast, and Preacher, and Salem, and Grimm, and The Strain, and Sleepy Hollow, and Hemlock Grove, and The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and You, and Lucifer. And on the all-horror movie channel Shudder, yes, we now have an all-horror movie channel, we got the reboot of Creepshow. And you know what? I know I'm missing quite a few on this list. There has just been so much to watch that it has been overwhelming. And if January was any indication, where the BBC reimagining of Dracula and the new horror show The October Faction premiered, and Apple TV brings us Servant, things are not slowing down at all. It has become so common to turn on either Netflix or Amazon Prime or Shudder and see a new show that we forgot what it used to be like. Back when there was only The X-Files, or back when there was only Tales from the Dark Side, or back when there was only HBO's The Hitchhiker. Who would have thought there would be an online YouTube channel named Alter that would showcase nothing but short horror films? And it would be an internet hit. This past 10 years is kind of what I dreamed of when I was a teenager. A time when the line between culture and pop culture was nearly insignificant, where horror was easily accessible and somewhat taken seriously. From 2010 to 2019, we saw the fruition of the geeks finally inheriting the earth. Nothing but blue skies, right? Well, not so fast. It turns out that time will tell isn't the only old saying that rings true. Another one ends up being, be careful what you wish for. There may not have been one dominant trend in horror over the last 10 years, but I think there was one dominant mood. This was the decade of dread. This was a decade where it felt like everybody in the world has been collectively waiting for the other shoe to drop. And I believe that dread permeated our culture and our entertainment, and most importantly, our horror stories. And I'll be talking more about that dark side of the Janus mask in part 2 of Death by Convenience. However, I'm going to end part 1 by giving you a list of the movies I thought were notable and influential from the years 2010 to 2015. I'll give the rest of that list from the years 2016 to 2019 at the end of part 2. And also at the end of part 2, I will reveal the movie that I feel best epitomizes the decade. Yes, I think it will probably be controversial, which means it will be a great horror conversation. And here's the list of horror films that I thought were pretty darn good that were released in 2010. Piranha 3D, The Reef, Rubber, a Serbian film, The Silent House, Sint, or Saint, whatever you want to call it, Stakeland, Tucker and Dale versus Evil, We Are What We Are, The Wolfman, which was a welcome return to practical effects from Rick Baker, Black Swan, The Crazies. That was a remake of a George Romero film directed by Breck Eisner. It was actually pretty good. Dream Home, I Spit on Your Grave, Insidious, The Intruder, a really good movie from Thailand, The Last Exorcism, Let Me In, which was a remake of Let the Right One In. And here's a list of the horror films that were released in 2011. It's a little bit shorter of a list, folks. I wasn't that big on 2011. Absentia, the Mike Flanagan film. The Human Centipede 2, full sequence. Tom Six writhes again. I have to say that when I first saw that movie, it really pissed me off. And then I watched it again. It still disturbs me quite a bit, but I see the nasty, deep, dark satire and the prodding on outrage that movie's trying for. The Incident from France, The Innkeepers, Red State by Kevin Smith. I have to say, I was really surprised how good that movie was. I did not expect Kevin Smith to make a horror film that kind of interested me at all, and it ended up being pretty good. The Tunnel, The Woman, You're Next. And now the list of horror films released in 2012. American Mary, The Bay, believe it or not, a horror movie directed by Barry Levinson. And even weirder, it's a found footage film, and it's pretty damn good. Barbarian Sound Studio. This is a really good film. If you haven't seen this one, I highly recommend Barbarian Sound Studio. The Cabin in the Woods, another really great horror film. It has one of the bleakest endings ever, and because it has humor in it, people laugh and walk away from that film going, that was so much fun. And they just saw one of the most disturbing Lovecraftian ends ever. Citadel, great little Irish film. Found, directed by Scott Shermer, an amazing film. It was made for $8,000, I believe. Micro-budget film, one of the very few that is truly good, well acted, well put together, and absolutely fucking disturbing. Grabbers, which is a magnificent Irish film that has monsters, sea monsters, and the only way that you can get away from being attacked by these monsters is being drunk. What a great idea. Don Coscarelli rides again with John Dies at the End, a wonderful head trip of a film. Rob Zombie's underrated Lords of Salem. If you only seen it once, watch it again. Lovely Molly. Maniac, which is a remake of the 1980 William Lustig film. This is actually really good. It's done in a very interesting artistic way. The Pact. Sinister. VHS. I will tell you that VHS really made me happy. It was one of the very few anthology films that I thought was extremely successful in what it did. It had a very clever idea, and quite honestly, it was the start of a spate of pretty good anthology films. Southbound would be another one. And The Woman in Black, Daniel Radcliffe, starring in a really good ghost story. And now, horror films released in 2013. Curse of Chucky, The Conjuring, Evil Dead, a great remake, really, really, really well done. Frankenstein's Army, really disturbing movie, I love it. It's really disturbing. Jugface, Mama, VHS 2, We Are What We Are. Yes, a remake of the Spanish film only a few years after the first one. I guess you can get away with that when it's a Spanish film. But I have to say that the Americanized version does some stuff really well. Willow Creek. Bobcat Goldthwait makes a horror movie, and he makes a damn good one. And World War Z. And now the horror films released in 2014. Annabelle. As Above, So Below. The Babadook. The Canal. Creep. Deliver Us from Evil. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. It Follows. Oculus. The Purge. Anarchy. Starry Eyes. The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Really good, inventive, imaginative, fun, and violent remake of the film from 1976. And now, horror films that were released in 2015. This is another down year, but still, some really good movies are in here. Crimson Peak, Guillermo del Toro. That one splits people as well. I love it, but I'm a Hammer horror film kind of guy, so I thought it was fantastic. Deathgasm. Just look it up. Demonic. The Invitation. Krampus. Another great Christmas movie. The Lazarus Effect. Sinister 2. Stung. So help me God, I absolutely love this killer giant mutated bee movie. It's just fucking great. We Are Still Here. a great Ted Gagin film, and The Witch, one of those seminal films, one of the best of the entire decade. And so there it is. There's the list of the movies from 2010 to 2015 that I thought were pretty darn good. I hope you enjoyed that list. I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of our show. Part 2 will be coming really soon. And remember to stay hell-bent. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and my Twitter handle is hellbenthorror. Please hit that subscribe button to get H4H hot off the press. And if you can do a review on iTunes or whatever app you listen to us on, that really helps people get to find us. And now for some Hellbent for Horror news. The podcast is available on some more outlets now, so you can listen to H4H on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn Radio, as well as the regular iTunes, Android, and Amazon apps. And let there be swag. H4H t-shirts are now on sale. We have a store on tpublic.com with a bunch of Hellbent for Horror designs, and you can have your choice of t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, something horrible beautiful for you or that someone special. The link to the merchandise store is on our website, hellbentforhorror.com. And until we meet again, stay hellbent.